todas e todos.
My name is Sérgio Cirino. I am a professor in the Federal University of Minas Gerais in Belo Horizonte. I have the pleasure of participating once again of another meeting of Clio. And this year we have our meeting with the 4th Congress of Brazilian Society of History of Psychology, organized by Professor Ana Jacob Vilela and Professor Rodrigo Miranda. Congratulations for the organization of this joint event in this virtual format that marks the new era. And I am impressed with the quality of what I've seen in terms of content and in terms of the technical organization of this event. So it's a pleasure for me to take part in this session. I thank my colleague, Professor Thomas Teo, for accepting the invitation to take part in our event. I'm going to do a brief presentation about him, and then we're going to have his lecture. Thomas Teo is of English origin. He was born in London. He did a doctorate in psychology at the University of Vienna in Austria. He was a fellow at the Max Planck Institute in Germany in the 1990s. Today, Professor Thomas Teo lives in Canada, where he is a professor at the York University. His main fields of academic interest are critical psychology, theoretical psychology, and the history of psychology. Teo is a professor in the prestigious and well-known graduate program in History of Psychology at the York University. He has a solid and internationally recognized academic career. He has held the position of editor in scientific journals and has published several articles in major specialized journals all over the world. He has also held positions such as the presidency of the International Society for Theoretical Psychology and the Division 24 of APA, the American Psychological Association. Division 24 belongs to the Society of Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology. For those who want to know more about Thomas, I suggest visiting his website. Someone from our team is going to include the link on the chat to you. And to finish this brief presentation, I'm going to summarize some of the main fields of interest for research of Professor Thomas Teo. He has concentrated currently in the studies about subjectivity and the theory and history of psychology, especially for the proposition of a critical history of psychology, besides the history of racism in psychology and social sciences, from a scientific, social, and political perspective. Once again, I would like to thank Professor Thomas Teo for the generosity of accepting our invitation to take part in the 14th Clio-Psyché encounter that is being this year organized with the 4th Congress of the Brazilian Society of Psychology History. Today, Professor Teo is going to give a lecture called Fascist, Subjectivity, Subhumanism, and Economic Darwinism. Thomas is going to speak a little bit about these topics on 30 to 35 minutes, and then we're going to have time for debate. If you have questions, please put on the chat, and people from the team are going to help us gather your questions, and at the end, we're going to have the debate. Once again, thank you very much, and I pass the floor to Professor Thomas Teo.
So, first I would like to thank you for this invitation to present at your conference. So I'm very glad doing that. Second, I would like to apologize because my topic is actually less historical than theoretical. What I'm doing is I am using history as a means for understanding a current problem. So I am in that sense, a bad historian, because I don't see history as the end, but as a history or historiography as a means, in this case, for a topic that has, of course, become more important again. And the topic, of course, is fascist subjectivity. So when I try to conceptualize fascist subjectivity, I'm confronted with a series of problems. And so I would like to talk about some of those problems. So the first question is, of course, is it possible to actualize a concept that has historical meanings and is embedded in specific location and times with important variations? So meaning, can I use a historical concept which we would usually associate with very specific times and locations for current purposes? And my answer is yes, we can do that. The second problem is, of course, why am I talking about fascist subjectivity? When fascism seems to be primarily a political problem or political project. So is it theoretically allowed to really focus on fascist subjectivity when it is about fascism as a political project? And again, my answer is no. As a psychologist, I'm of course interested in fascist subjectivity, and we have to actually try to grasp what is at the core of fascist subjectivity. And then I have academic and personal interests. And I mentioned this before, we have the re-emergence of fascist subjectivity in our times. In many continents, we see, so to say, fascist subjectivity re-emerging. And so I want to find a good conceptualization of that topic. Fascist subjectivity, of course, has been part of critical psychological reflection. So I'm talking about critical theory, but I'm also talking about critical psychology. Now, critical theory, ironically, I agree much more with its sociological, political, economic theories, less so with its psychological theories. And when it comes to critical psychology, I agree much more with critical psychologies. I'm talking about specifically German critical psychology or even the cultural historical school. I agree much more with the psychological analysis and less so with the social political analysis of critical psychology. I also have a biographical interest. First, I grew up in Austria. I grew up in a village that was very close to a facility where people with mental disabilities were housed. These people were removed in the 1940s from this facility and moved to Schloss Hartheim, which was the center of the Nazi euthanasia program. And most of them were killed. Another element of my biography is, of course, I had a grandfather who was a socialist, joined the SR during fascism in Austria, and then became a social democrat again. That's also biographically interesting to me, what is going on there. So in short, I have actually personal and academic interests in trying to understand fascist subjectivity. So fascism is a political and social movement. I agree with that. But psychosocial dimensions have always been mentioned in the literature. And even if you go back to, I have here on another screen, just gonna read this to you maybe. You have Eco, for example, discusses the following elements of fascism: cult of tradition, rejection of modernism, irrationalism, disagreement is treason, fear of difference, appeal to frustrated middle class, obsession with the plot, life is permanent warfare, contempt for the weak, and so forth. And then Paxton, just to give you another example, focused on one's own group, that one's group is a victim, the brotherhood of unity and purity, authority of national male leaders, beauty of violence. And then you can go, Stanley's more recent book, or Giroux. Giroux, for example, talks about intolerance, demagoguery, paranoia, conspiracy theories, bigotry, falsehoods, militarism, nativism, racism, misogyny, ultranationalism, celebration of ignorance, and so forth. So if you look at this, you can see basically that there is also psychosocial dimensions mentioned in the literature. And if we go back to critical theory, such as Wilhelm Reich, Theodor Adorno, Erich Fromm, you can see that they very specifically mention psychological dimensions. So Wilhelm Reich, of course, the idea of the mass psychology of fascism, connecting it with sexual repression. Theodor Adorno with his famous book on the authoritarian personality. Erich Fromm talks about the social character of a fascist personality, also focusing on authoritarianism. My critique is that those descriptions are too unspecific. Authoritarianism, sexual envy, sexual repression is too unspecific. And I think people in the literature have pointed out, rightly so, that you probably can find these elements also on the left. You can have left-wing authoritarianism. Stalinism would be one example. You might find sexual repression along the whole political spectrum. You might find sexual envy along the whole political spectrum. So I'm not discounting those elements. What I'm doing is I'm suggesting that they are too unspecific or to understand fascist subjectivity. And when it comes to fascist subjectivity, we have to look at the content of fascist subjectivity, not just an internal dynamic, not just an internal psychological dynamic. What is actually the content of fascist subjectivity? That is what I'm interested in. That's what I'm trying to figure out. And in order to make this point, I have this idea, and that's maybe a slightly complicating the discussion. So I'm not going to go deeply into this issue. I suggest a theory of subjectivity that always considers the nexus, the connection of intrasubjectivity, intersubjectivity, and sociosubjectivity. So the term sociosubjectivity doesn't really exist. It's a term I believe I made up, but it reflects exactly those issues of the societal, political, historical dimensions of subjectivity. And they cannot be reduced, from my perspective, to intrasubjectivity or intersubjectivity. So intrasubjectivity is usually what is considered subjectivity in many psychological disciplines. Psychoanalysis, of course, is a strong focus on that. Also, of course, on intersubjectivity. Phenomenology also focuses on intersubjectivity. And of course, you could make the argument that the cultural historical school and German critical psychology focused exactly on the socio-subjectivity. And my point is, for an understanding of subjectivity, you need to understand this nexus, and you don't need to give primacy to either. So you don't need to give primacy to internal dynamics. You don't need to give primacy to structure, the societal and the political and the historical. So that leads us into a different debate. And if I take this theory of subjectivity seriously and want to understand so to say, the core, the content of fascist subjectivity. I also make a distinction between, okay, this is Aristotelian, essential properties and accidental properties of a concept. And I think at the core of fascist subjectivity is or are capitalist political economic ideas and practices combined with racism and or subhumanism. So this is, for me, at the core of fascist subjectivity. So I pick up on a certain tradition in critical theory, if you like, even in Marxist theory, that capitalist political economic ideas are central to fascism, but they are combined with either racism or subhumanism, depending what is appropriate, and I try to explain this in the rest of this presentation. So try to explain what I mean by this argument that capitalism combined with racism and or subhumanism is at the core of fascist subjectivity. So this means that I suggest that fascist subjectivity is based on a socio-relational ontology. This is more than just a relational ontology. It is more than just intersubjectivity. It is indeed this idea that we have to take into account the societal. So let me first define wealth, because I'm going to use this term throughout this presentation. By wealth, I mean having, producing, contributing, distributing something more than is needed for survival. So I'm not going to go into discussion of political economy, where does wealth come from, who is responsible for wealth. Some of a very generic definition that includes having, producing, contributing, distributing goods, services, more than is needed for survival. And I think the fascist philosophy of alterity suggests there is not enough wealth for all human beings. More specifically, so that's one step. The second step is wealth should not include the other. The other, and I mean, so to say, with a capital O, whoever we define as the other, wealth should not include the other, and or wealth can be extracted from the other. And I think that justifications that we find are rational and emotional, but from my perspective, they are not irrational. So I emphasize again, so to say, I think there's a, even if I don't agree with these justifications, even if I don't agree with the logic, I think there is a rationality in those justifications. There's a rationality in racism and subhumanism, and it's not purely irrational. That's also, I would draw a distinction here to certain other approaches to fascist subjectivity. I think there is a rationality to the fascist philosophy alterity, in a sense that it also may reflect people's experiences, and I'm going to come back to that argument. So racializing and subhumanizing discourses and practices were used for colonialism, for war, for exclusion, for exploitation and extermination. So who is the other? This is where we come in with racism and subhumanism. Well, we have the close other. People who live among us, let's say in a country, who lives among us. Well, there's the racialized minority. Minorities live with us, outside us, the person with disabilities, the communist, the prisoner, the poor, the lesbian, and so forth. All those people live among us. And if racism doesn't work, because they might look perfectly, let's say, German, subhumanism works. So if I cannot racialize a specific person or a specific group, I always can subhumanize them. And racism and subhumanism work with affective cognitions based on discourses, practices, images, and imaginations. So I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. So when people mention nationalism as being specific for fascism or fascist subjectivity, we have to be clear that it's a very specific nationalism. So it would not be a multicultural nationalism. So for example, Canada has a multicultural self-understanding and a multicultural public policy. And based on that, that type of nationalism obviously would not be characteristic for fascism. So it is a nationalism based on exclusion. And the second point that I want to emphasize is some people sometimes say, oh, it's only the working classes who have fascist subjectivities. No, you can find fascist subjectivity also in the educated classes, in the educated populations. And just to give you one example, of course, they can use scientific racism. They can use racism that is based on science, pseudoscience we will call it, but scientific racism has a long history in academia. So if you go back to Hitler's Mein Kampf, and you look at sort of what was his preoccupation in terms of enemies. Yes, there's a variety of enemies and grievances listed there, but the main enemies were always and the Marxists. There's long passages on Jews, there's long passages on Marxists. So the Jews could be racialized and subhumanized. They could be constructed as inferior and as parasites. So parasites, so it would be a subhuman category, comes into place when you're below the standard of humanity. Of course, if you're an animal, if you're a parasite, if you're a rat, if you're a cockroach, then you're obviously subhuman. The Jews could be racialized and subhumanized. The German communists could not be racialized unless they were Jewish German communists. But let's say they were not Jewish German communists, just German communists. They could not be racialized, but they always could be subhumanized. And when you look at German fascism, you also find always economic arguments. And I'll give you an example later when it comes to German with disabilities, very clearly that sort of the economic arguments, the argument that I made before about political economy, still be at the core at fascist subjectivity playing a role. And you could use science, appealing to people who are more cognitively inclined, and or propaganda for targeting emotions and affects. So again, you can have a scientific dimension and a propaganda dimension to German fascism. And it depends, so to say, what kind of target group you have in order to make a scientific argument or to make a purely affective argument. And fascist politics, but also fascist subjectivity, clearly relates to necropolitics. Necropolitics is a term coined by the African philosopher, Cameroon philosopher Mbembe, and it's not so much the right to kill, but the ability to expose people to death. And necropolitics relies, so an argument of mine, on a receptive fascist mentality, and is not just a moment of the past, but a mentality that can be found in liberal democracies. So my question is, who is diable? So diable, I think, is also not an English term. It's also an English term that I just made up. The question is, who is diable? And diable is different from disposable. Disposable you need replacements. So if you have slavery, slaves are disposable, you can be replaced with a whole set of new slaves. So slaves would be dyeable and disposable, but there are certain groups of people who are dyeable, but you don't need any kind of replacement for them. So clearly you want to get rid of them. There's no need for replacements for them. And in German fascism, in classical fascism, of course, it was the Jew, the gypsy, the communist, gays, disabled persons, whoever was perceived as an enemy to the state. Those people were dyeable. And in liberal democracy, I think where you find indeed combinations of racist, economic, and subhuman arguments, it is asylum seekers and their children. So migrants and their children are dyeable. We can expose them to death. That is basically the mentality. In the COVID-19 pandemic, we see the elderly are dyeable, people with pre-existing medical conditions, indigenous peoples, precarious workers, prisoners, LGBTQ members, and so forth. In law enforcement, let's say in the United States, blacks are dyeable. So this is what I mean by necropolitics, the question about who is dyeable. And you could make the distinction between active dyeability and passive dyeability. And I think I have a slide on this as well. Or you just have here a slide on, as an example, this is the Barca Nostra. The Barca Nostra was a boat, a ship, that had 800 migrants from Africa towards Europe on board. And it sank close to the Libyan coast, and all 800 migrants died on this ship. And that's an example for me of necropolitics, of dyeability. Christoph Büchel is an artist who recovered the shipwreck and exhibited at the Biennale in Venice last year, 2019, as a sign or as a symbol of the failings of European countries when it comes to immigration, when it comes to migrants. Of course, there was a large outrage that he would display this boat during an art festival. Especially conservative right-wing Italian politicians complained about this exhibit. But it is sort of a symbol of the failings of European politics that is perfectly fine in letting people basically die, although many of those deaths are actually preventable. So let me come back to political economy. So in fascist subjectivity, racism and subhumanism are invoked when it comes to the question of the production, distribution, accumulation of wealth. So with an ideological apparatus, practical apparatus as well, we deserve more than the other because they are not as good as us, they are not as competitive, they are lazy, they lack intelligence, and so forth. In addition, the other is responsible for the lack of wealth, or we can take their wealth away, because they belong to an inferior race or are subhuman. And what I think the ideological apparatus works with historically constituted experiences of scarcity. So people have historical knowledge of scarcity, and an ideological apparatus works with this experience of scarcity by not blaming the real source of scarcity, but by blaming the other as the source of scarcity. And the Jewish Marxist, of course, is the perfect representative of the other in classical German fascism as an enemy who challenges the seemingly natural order of existing wealth. In neoliberal capitalism, you have, let's say, the capitalism since the 1980s, late 1970s, you have enormous pressure on individuals and families. You have objectively an economic organization that has benefited the rich much more than else. Subjectively, you have the feeling that you're never up to the standards of an entrepreneurial self. You have to fight, you have to be in constant competition in a marketplace, and any shortcomings, so the ideology goes, must be attributed to you. And here's the point that I try to make. Not the existing economic organization is to blame, but the Jew in Nazi Germany, now the foreigner, the migrant, the lazy, the unproductive, the poor, the socialist, the anti-entrepreneurial self. So if you don't have an entrepreneurial self, you're to blame actually for those shortcomings that we find in capitalism, in neoliberal capitalism. Economic stagnation, economic decline, increasing inequality are not attributed to a capitalist system, and unreasonable psychological demands, but to the other. So I want to point out that capitalism doesn't automatically mean fascism. So there are supporters of capitalism that don't invoke racism, that don't invoke subhumanism, and so then you're not necessarily embodying fascist subjectivity. The problem is that the boundary is very permeable. What is called slippage into fascist subjectivity is possible. And I think you can see that in recent necropolitical debates in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we find arguments that people suggest marginalized people, the elderly, the poor can die because we need to maintain the economy. And economy, a capitalist economy, of course, is meant. And people, and for economic reasons, we can promote active diability or passive diability. So certain people just can die for economic reasons. So I think that you find a slippage into fascist subjectivity when it comes to capitalism, and more current experiences, I guess, corroborate that idea. So racism, I think racism is a pretty clear, is pretty much understood by many, so I'm not going to cover this very extensively. What you have with race is, first I want to say that the violent treatment of the other is not historically new. So even Aristotle, you can find passages where he talks about Western Europeans or Central Europeans lacking intelligence. So, okay, that isn't necessarily violent treatment. You could say that's a form of epistemic violence, but the construction of the other as an inferior is not historically new. What is new is to have race theories where you come up with the division of humanity into distinct races. And I think that they provide an intellectual and effective rationale for the domination of the other. They justified slavery, colonialism, exploitation, and the killing of the other. And you can find this among Enlightenment thinkers, Immanuel Kant. And I'm very sympathetic to Immanuel Kant. I quite often actually use Immanuel Kant. But Immanuel Kant, of course, was instrumental in developing race theories, and some of the stuff that he said about racialized minorities are quite horrible. But the point is that you have in Western modernism, in Western liberalism, a stream of enlightened racism and also a stream of scientific racism. So subjective racism, I just want to focus on that. I'm not going to discuss much systemic racism. Is basically, let's say if I construct, and that can be cognitive affective differences. These differences can be real or imagined. I naturalize these differences. It is in their nature to be that way. I evaluate these differences, believing that we are superior, they are inferior, invoking a sense of supremacy, and then suggest actions against them. I participate basically in subjective racism. I'm drawing here on Memmi, very close to Memmi's definition of racism. And I think what Memmi didn't point out, but this is indeed sort of a form of subjective racism that is taking place, which is different from systemic racism, where you have patterns of outcomes that disadvantage specific groups. So if you say Black lives do not matter, it could be the outcome of racism, or it could be the outcome of a fascist subjectivity. So here's an example of scientific racism. 18th century, you have Pieter Camper, Dutch scientist, philosopher. He devised the facial angle in order to make a case for the more animal likeness of blacks. So he drew the facial angle and suggested that blacks are also animals. Pieter Camper was a religious person, and for that reason had some kind of universalist religious theory. He believed in the unity of humanity. But nevertheless, he made those points which justified actually that blacks are closer to monkeys and apes, which was sort of what we call sort of scientific, but at the time it was of course a scientific justification of racism. That was in the 18th century, and you can find it throughout the 19th century, you can find it throughout the 20th century, you can even find it nowadays. There's still articles published nowadays during this time period that people make arguments about the inferiority of blacks as opposed to whites. And there's another interesting element that I want to mention here. So instead of race, you can now use culture and religion. So Muslim culture, Muslim religion can be treated as if they were a racial category, or if membership was something natural, unchangeable, or biological. So you can then have a racialization of Muslims. They're constructed as if they were a race, they're treated as if they were a race. They can be racialized for that reason as inferior because of their religion, because of cultural practice, because of their appearances, or they can be subhumanized as well. And this is especially the case in European countries where you have migration, let's say from Syria, where you find Muslim populations, where you find actually literal references to Muslim people being subhuman. So I have some quotes by right-wing politicians in Austria that refer in fact to Muslims as human. So what is then subhumanism? And so this is maybe a more interesting concept, maybe less known. And I want to mention two works within subhumanism. The first one is Stoddard, who wrote a book called The Revolt Against Civilization, the menace of the underman. Underman basically subhuman, and he defines the underman as a person in society measures under the standards of capacity and adaptability imposed by the social order in which it is. That's both. And as you can see, this is an extremely flexible definition. And he meant basically not only primitives, as he calls them, degenerates, non-European races, non-realized populations, lower classes, proletariat, and culture. So what he needed is, he's an American, and he needed a concept not only targets blacks, because blacks, of course, have race theories, so you don't need, but you have also poor people in America, you have also lower classes in America, you have the proletariat in America, you used to have communists in America, and they demonstrate, they strike, and they are, according to Stoddard, under the standards of adaptability imposed by the social order. So we needed a concept that would also cover all those other groups that could not be captured by race theories. And if you look closer, it was basically the idea everybody behaves disorderly, chaotic, substandard, or deviant to be a subhuman. As you can see, this is a very flexible concept that very quickly people could become subhuman. I think you have a slide for that. I'll make this point. I'm going to come back to that. And the second source is an educational manual from the SS Educational Office. And it's a 50-page booklet, the Untermensch, the subhuman. And what was fascinating in this booklet to me was that it didn't use much text at all. It got rid of all scientific words, scientific expositions, discussions, and just focused on pictures. This is what I meant before. The subhuman works through images and imaginations. So they compared the German soldier with the Russian soldier, the German woman with the Jewish woman, the German child with the Soviet child, German art with degenerate art. And it was only the contrasting pictures that they used. And basically the idea was not, you don't need a cognitive explanation, justification for what is subhuman behavior. You can see it, just look at it. It is right in front of you. Those people that look like this, that behave like this, are clearly subhuman. There was no scientific justification necessary anymore. So that was very fascinating. It was also fascinating, everybody could become a subhuman, even the Western enemies of Germany were suddenly subhuman. And this is what I mean here. The German person with disabilities could be subhumanized, and they use economic arguments. In this example, I translate 60,000 German marks is the cost of this genetically ill person for the national community during his lifetime. Comrade or national comrade, this is also your money. So clearly they used economic arguments in concert with subhumanism. So what is the advantage of subhumanism? Advantage is quotation marks. It's a visual ontology operating with images, visualizations, pictures, and imaginations. You can imagine, people imagine how the asylum seeker from Mexico looks like. Sometimes they see it, but they can also imagine how they look like. They imagine the tattoos, they imagine certain behaviors, substandard behaviors, and so forth. Subhumanism is much more malleable than racism. As I say, everybody could become a subhuman under the right circumstances. Under the right circumstances, I could make anybody into a subhuman. I can put you into conditions where you have such restricted range of action possibilities, behavioral possibilities, that I then can construct you as a subhuman. So if you're forced to flee a country and you're housed in awful circumstances, well, maybe you show behavior that I then classify as subhuman or visualize as subhuman. Subhumanism has also an action imperative. Now, racism has an action imperative, but I don't think to the same degree that subhumanism has an action imperative. What does this mean? If you are confronted in your community with a parasite, you have to do something. If you're confronted with a cockroach, you have to do something. You can't just leave it be, you have to do something. And this is what I mean by subhumanism as an action imperative. So if you construct somebody as subhuman, well, we have to do something because they're actually not, they don't share the qualities of humanism anymore, they're subhuman. So there's an advantage to this concept. What can we do to resist? So I'm coming to the end here. What can we do to resist fascist subjectivity? I think what I try to make the argument is that fascist subjectivity has a logic, quotation mark, within capitalism. It's not just irrational. I'm not discounting irrational emotions and affects and thoughts and so forth, but I think there's a certain plausibility to fascist subjectivity within capitalism. If we think wealth, there's not enough wealth, we have to exclude people from wealth, well, it's not unlikely that some people say, well, the other should be excluded from wealth, and the other is the racialized other, and the other is the subhumanized other. And therefore, education has to focus, so to say, on some of those aspects. Of course, case for the critical sciences, and suggest that we don't only need sciences that support and benefit the economy. Obviously, I think I'm speaking here to a group of people who shares this thought that, you know, if you have only sciences that work for the neoliberal economy, you will not be able to overcome those types of fascist subjectivity, which seems quite obvious to me. Visual media and art, if we talk about subhumanism, then we need, so to say, also visual media. If you want to combat subhumanism, you need visual media and art. You have to be careful, though, and I'm going to show you at the end a slide that we don't overdo visual media, because I don't want, so to say, a struggle for who has the better pictures for something. Do the fascists or the anti-fascists have the best pictures when it comes to crime, for example? Can nonviolence overcome fascism? I'm also certain that education is not enough. Clearly, we need also direct action, which is, of course, a principle of Antifa. The boat captains in the European Mediterranean make the case for that. There were Antifa members who protected migrants in Germany. So there's people who stand up for migrants and people who have been subhumanized, and education is not always sufficient. And I understand for academics that it's very difficult to accept direct action because it's much more comfortable, not even excluding myself, sitting sort of in one's office in front of the computer. But I'm sure that sitting in front of one's computer is not going to overcome fascist subjectivity alone. Political action is needed. Same argument as before. And psychology is only one small element. If I take the idea of the nexus of socio-subjectivity, intersubjectivity, and intrasubjectivity seriously, it's clear that psychology can only be a very, very small part in this debate. Empathy is not enough. There's all this focus on how we have to increase empathy. My point is that people who become fascists or have fascist subjectivities, they were perfectly capable of empathy. They're just not empathetic towards the other. They are not empathetic towards the racialized other. They are not empathetic towards the subhumanized other. They might be perfectly empathetic towards their community, towards their within their race. So empathy is not enough. It could be a short-term instrument, a short-term tool, but I think that psychology will play only a very small role in this debate. And my last slide here, this is Aylan Kurdi. I'm not sure if you saw this picture. It went around in Europe and North America. This is Aylan Kurdi, a migrant child who died in the Mediterranean Sea. And this picture, for a very short term, elicited empathy with migrants. Of course, this is a child that is light-skinned and wears clothes like a typical European child, could not be distinguished from a European child, a white European child, and that raised empathy. But as I said before, I think one has to be really, really careful not to work with images, because then you have a struggle. Images that elicit empathy, images that elicit subhumanism, and also that, you know, empathy is a very short-term principle. Yes, it elicited empathy for a very short period of time in terms of migration to Europe, but then this was forgotten as well, you know, and next week you have a different picture about something else, and working with images by itself for that reason is, in my view, insufficient. So this is my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
I would like to thank Professor Thomas Teo for this excellent lecture. Very provocative, very inspiring, especially in these moments that we're living currently. While the lecture was happening, I was also following the counting of the votes for the election of the United States, and I think all of us are. I think we are all doing that in the last 3 days, and we are shocked. I believe we are all shocked with the level of what is being discussed there by President Donald Trump. And in many cases, in many instances, and to a certain extent, it incentivizes part of what you were describing as the fascist subjectivity. I'm not saying that he is this person. He is fascist. People may consider him fascist, but certainly he incentivizes. There are many people in the United States and the rest of the world that are thinking with fascist subjectivity because of the way that we are all certainly following what's happening in the United States. That will have a lot of consequences over there, but also consequences all over the world, especially here in Brazil. In the case of Brazil, we have a president that reproduces ipsis literis what happens in the United States. He's a follower of Trump. So we have some questions. Very provocative, as I said, very provocative and inspiring presentation, Professor Theo. So we have 4 questions from the audience to ask to you. We're going to start with the question asked by Professor Felipe Degani from the State University of Rio de Janeiro. The question is, some psychosocial theories, Adorno, for example, outlined the characteristics of a certain kind of fascist subjectivity. Others, like Arendt, I'm sorry, Professor, they took it off the screen. I'm going to search here on the chat. Okay, I can find it now. Others like Arendt, Milgram, and Reich described fascist traits in the normal subjectivity. How does the critical psychology assess both visions of Adorno and Reich and Milgram?
I think I mentioned Reich, and my critique would be that focusing on internal dynamics, on sexual repression as one example, is insufficient. I'm not opposed to that type of description of fascist subjectivity. I think it just doesn't come to the core of fascist subjectivity. What I'm trying to say is it's actually very simple. It's actually, you can have actually very parsimonious definition of fascist subjectivity, and that is what I try to do. Why make it complicated? Why make it, or let me phrase it differently. As I said in my presentation, do we really believe that sexual repression only occurs with fascists? Does sexual repression not occur, so to say, throughout the political spectrum? And I think the same can be said. The same argument can be made for Adorno. Adorno's authoritarian personality, and Adorno went down the road of doing empirical work on it, and I mean quantitative empirical work. And then his theory could be tested. And so people went out and looked at authoritarianism among people who support sort of the leftist policies, leftist politics. And I don't see, and I think authoritarianism is one moment, but I don't see that the authoritarian personality is limited to a right-wing personality. Basically, that is my argument here. And so if this is the case, then authoritarianism is not an essential characteristic of fascist subjectivity, but an accidental characteristic of fascist subjectivity. So that would be my argument. What I'm trying to do is to update it. I try to make it as simple as possible. I try to have a pretty precise definition of fascist subjectivity. And finally, when it comes to Milgram, Milgram focuses on obedience and, obedience to authority. Again, do I think that obedience to authority occurs only in the right-wing context? No, I think that obedience to authority also could happen in left-wing context. Obedience to authority could happen under Stalinism. Obedience to authority could happen in East Germany. So is that then an essential characteristic of fascist subjectivity to think about obedience to authority? No, I don't think it's an essential characteristic of fascist subjectivity. I think it is an accidental characteristic of fascist subjectivity. So that would be my answer. And I understand that or let me phrase it again slightly differently. For me, it seems very obvious. What is actually the content of fascist subjectivity? Well, it is very simple. It is actually racism. It is subhumanism, and it's combined, I think, with a political economic thinking of capitalism. And that is, I think, a very simple definition of fascist subjectivity. And I'm not denying other aspects that were mentioned in the literature. So yes, some people can be very authoritarian. Some people have don't like science. Some people, some of the attributes that we're reading that Cirino brings up and that more contemporary writers also bring up. So all of those things can play a role, but I don't see the degree to which they are essential. So Stanley, for example, says it's an us versus them mentality. Us versus them. Is that automatically fascist to have an us versus them mentality? I don't think it's automatically fascist to say us versus them, because I could have my football team. I don't know. Let's say you're a fan of Bavaria Munich, and then you don't like, I don't know, Dortmund, and it's an us versus them, but it doesn't mean that you're automatically fascist. Even if you might even think so that you hate the opponents of your own favorite soccer team or football team. That doesn't make you automatically fascist. It has to be there has to be content to the us versus them. So it's us versus them, meaning the inferior race, the subhuman people. Then it becomes an us versus them. Us who have a certain kind of supremacy, and them who are inferior, who are inferior and who are subhuman. Then you have actually, then you can talk about a fascist subjectivity. But just having two soccer teams playing against each other, not liking the opponent soccer team, doesn't make you necessarily a fascist subjectivity. So I try to be very, very specific what I mean, what is actually the content of fascist subjectivity. And that's what I try to do here, being very, very specific. What is actually the content? Hello?
Very much for your answer, Professor Theo. We have here another question. I'm going to read it. It's by Diego Mendonça from the audience. The revisionist and negationist trends in the current history may be considered some of the main tools for the production of the subhumanism logics.
Can you repeat that?
Yes, I will repeat it. The revisionists and the revisionists in general trends and the current historiographic narrative, can they be considered some of the main tools for the logical production of the logics around subhumanism?
I think one has to be specific what one means by revisionist history, because you could mean revisionist history in the German context means basically rewriting the history of German fascism and rewriting in a way that fascism was a result of the struggle against something more evil, which was Soviet communism. That is one way of people have trying to rewrite German history and German fascism. There's also revisionist histories in psychology. That would be obviously a very, very different topic. People are also trying to rewrite the history of American history. But the revisionism in American history means indeed could have a progressive dimension when people try to include slavery and exploitation and capitalism as part of the history of the United States. So in order to answer this question, I want to be very specific which type of history you're referring to. But to answer the question, I'm not trying to avoid this question. I think that my point is that subhumanism actually doesn't really need science as much as it needs images and imaginations. And that's why I think it has become more dominant again in the area of social media, social networks. People can very quickly share photos and images. And very quickly, you just need to see, seemingly, you need to see what is going on in the world, what is going on with other people, rather than providing a revisionist history of the United States, which is read by a few people and so forth. So I think my point with subhumanism is that, yes, you can use text, you can use science, you can use academia, you can use magazines, but very often you just need images and imaginations, which is a much more effective tool for distributing subhumanism. So when, to give you an example, and Trump was mentioned before, when people talked about migration from Mexico to the United States, they showed, you just send around an image of Mexican gang members who were tattooed, and you send this around your networks and say this is what you want to come to the United States. Basically, then the visual imaginations, the gang members come to the United States, gangsters come to the United States, and therefore we have to restrict migration. You don't need a scientific test, you don't need a revisionist history to do that. You just need an image to do that. You have a series of images to do that. And so in the area of social media, I think that subhumanism has become a much more effective tool of propaganda again. It appeals much more to affects than to cognition, appeals much more to imaginations and images than to academic or scientific texts. So when I mentioned, when I read the Nazi pamphlet, I was surprised how little text there was. It was all about images. And you can very quickly discern if somebody is seemingly a subhuman being by showing subhuman behavior and so forth. So you just show it, and that is all what you need. You don't need a scientific text to that. So to say, the idea that images then speak for themselves, they have an effective impact on you, and you don't need difficult academic texts anymore. So I'm not sure if this completely answers your questions, but because I didn't know exactly what you're referring to when you talk about revisionist history. If you're talking specifically about German revisionist history, rewriting German fascism, if that's what you meant. And I think it would just be, an ideological practice of changing our understanding of fascism. I'm not sure if it appeals to subhumanism. I think you have much more effective means for contributing to subhumanism than doing so as an academic text on the history of German fascism.
We have another question, Professor, that was asked by Professor Carolina Mello here from the state of Minas Gerais. She asks, can the teaching of the psychological science in assistance to a scientific literacy, as she calls, of the society, could contribute to minimizing fascist subjectivity? So the teaching of psychological science could contribute to minimizing the fascist subjectivity, in your opinion?
Yes. Of course, as academics, we have a bias towards education. We have a bias towards knowledge. We have a bias towards science. So we think that education is important in combating fascist subjectivity. What I try to make the point is also that I think it's not sufficient. But of course, education is one tool in combating fascist subjectivity. The second question, of course, is, or the second point is that you have to ask, how do we teach actually the history of psychology? and and that again makes a difference. Is the history of psychology written in a way that it is celebratory of the main figures in, let's say, American psychology, or is it a critical history of psychology? And many books in the history of psychology are still using a very traditional approach that is actually not a critical approach. So that's what I tried to say before. If you use the history of psychology to provide a justification of the status quo, if you provide a celebration of the status quo, then probably there will be less an interrogation of fascist subjectivity. So we know that many presidents of the American Psychological Association. We know that many leaders in American psychology were supporters of the eugenics movement, were supporters of scientific racism, participated in scientific racism, were instrumental in distributing scientific racism in the United States. So, and you know, of course, if you use Galton as one pioneer of Western psychology, people like to use Galton. Well, how do we talk then about Galton? Do we talk only about the accomplishments of Galton, or do we talk about Galton as one of the as the founders of eugenics, the founder of eugenics, as a pioneer of scientific racism, as a person who went to Africa on exhibitions and poured boiling water over the bodies of his black servants as punishment? Are we talking about those elements when we talk about Galton, or are we talking only about, you know, fingerprints and weather maps and association tests and those things when we think about Galton? And you could say the same thing about American bias. Goddard, of course, is a good example. Louis Terman is example. There's tons of examples in American psychology that laid the foundation for what we call now a colonial history of American psychology. So, colonial history of psychology challenge fascist subjectivity? My answer would be no. Can a decolonial history of American psychology combat fascist subjectivity? My answer would be yes. You need to write a decolonial history of American psychology. And what is my point here? Well, it depends how you write the history of psychology. And if you write, what we would call a critical history of psychology, a critical history of American psychology, well, it would contribute, I think, to a deconstruction of fascist subjectivity. But if you're continuing, so to say, with a great man approach, a celebratory approach, then probably you're not combating fascist subjectivity. So that would be my simple answer, I guess.
Very good. I would like to make a comment to this question asked by Professor Mello. Great question and great answer, Professor Tate. I had the access to the text that you wrote and that you prepared for the presentation. I believe everybody else that is watching is jealous, and because I had the access to the text, and they only will have the access to the text when it's published. But at the end of the text, you make a reflection, and you are discussing resistance to that subjectivity, and you present that you just repeated to us right now that the education is not enough. And in order to build this argument, since it was at the end of the text, probably you couldn't get deeper in this argument. You say that one of the hindrances is a certain academic subjectivity that the professors and the universities have, and that may be temper this exercise of the antidote, so to speak, against fascist subjectivity. If I understood well, that would be a sort of an antidote. And somehow we professors in colleges, we are involved in a history that makes it hard for us to take those stances. So I would like to ask you a little bit about the academic subjectivity that you presented very briefly at the end of the text. Does it dialogue with this difficulty that we have to subvert the order, to present an antidote to the fascist subjectivity?
I think coming back to what I said before about intrasubjectivity, intersubjectivity, and sociosubjectivity, we have to analyze academic subjectivity in the context of neoliberalism. And in the context of neoliberalism, where academics have to become entrepreneurs, where they have to sell their knowledge, where they have to promote themselves, where they have to sell themselves, where they have to market themselves, it is very difficult to engage in a subjectivity that would invoke what I call, so to say, anti-fascist activities. So I understand, so to say, in the analysis that academic subjectivity is constricted more and more to very narrow activities. And I'm not even exempting myself. I see that myself. And people in our context, for example, more and more look at how many citations they have, how many publications do they have. Do they have more publications than other people? Do they have more citations than other people? And this is sort of really the neoliberalization of academic subjectivity. And in this context, first of all, it is very difficult to remain modest about one's own knowledge claims, because in neoliberalism, of course, you have to exaggerate your knowledge claims. And the other dimension is that you cannot move, or it makes it more difficult to move outside of a narrowly defined academic subjectivity, which is really the subjectivity that is confined to research and teaching and maybe service. And for that reason, political action is very, very difficult. And even anti-fascist activity is very, very difficult. Anti-fascist activity would not count towards anything in your academic CV. Political activity would not count much in your academic CV. So there is no reward structure within academia to assume that type of subjectivity. And I think it has become more restricted and more narrow over the years, especially under neoliberalism, to move outside one's narrow expertise and practices in academic subjectivity. So to give you an example, people even have a hard time signing letters. And I always say signing a letter is the minimal activity of an academic. So there's a certain initiatives, and people want to sign. Let's say there's a letter going around about supporting indigenous groups, let's say in Canada, or indigenous research in Canada, and then people have to sign. And then academics spend days and days and days about changing one word in this petition because they don't like one single word, and they think that their own signature is so influential, is so important, that they can only sign if it's a perfect formulation of an indigenous petition. And that is just a trivial example that I've experienced in academia, that small activities such as signing a letter in Canada with zero consequences. Nobody's gonna fault you if you sign a petition on indigenous people, but academics have such a limited perspective on political action that they think they can only sign if the resolution is a perfect resolution. That's just one example. And it becomes much more complicated when it comes to political action, and when it comes even to raising, let's say, anti-fascist activities. I think it would be hard. It would be very hard to find people who are willing to participate in anti-fascist activity. It's not part of the subjectivity of academics, and that is sad, and that limits, of course, the influence that academics can have when it comes to anti-fascist activity. So imagine I lived in Germany for 7 years, and anti-fascists will go to a refugee camp. They know that there's a march planned by fascists to maybe throw stones and burn refugee homes, and for sure that violence will be involved. And then to stand up there and say we're going to resist that type of violence and maybe invoke violence ourselves as a defensive mechanism is extremely difficult for academics to envision. And and it's not only difficult to envision this activity, it's also difficult to envision even to support that activity. And that is sort of the troubling moment for me, that academics then would have a hard time supporting anti-fascist activity. And my question is, I'm also a multiracial person myself, so I have a multiracial background, and when you travel on a public transit, and when you travel on a streetcar or on the subway, let's say in Germany, and there are certain districts where neo-Nazis will come onto the streetcar, and if you're a minority person, who would you rather have there when 3 neo-Nazis stand there and start glancing at you, start looking at you? Would you have 3 professors standing there with you, or do you have 3 anti-fascists standing there with you? And my answer would be, I'd rather have 3 anti-fascists standing there and not 3 professors standing there with me. And and so this is what I mean by that even if we can't support, even if we want to be involved, so to say, for a variety of reasons in anti-fascist activity, well, at least, so to say, have some support or some kind of recognition of the value of anti-fascist activity when it comes to racialized and subhumanized people. So I'm not completely sure if I answered your question perfectly, but my point is that it's probably very difficult to find anti-fascist support beyond, so to say, a verbal recognition that goes beyond pure, yes, we agree with fascism is bad, in terms of concrete action by academics. I think that would be my answer. Did I answer your question?
Yes. Very well. Thank you very much for your answer. Thank you, Thomas. We have a few more questions. I believe that we're going to have time to ask only one last question. Before we finish here, we're walking towards the end of this excellent lecture by Professor Theo. I would just like to say that this lecture is going to be available afterwards on the Clio-Psyché channel on YouTube, and I'm sure that this is going to be watched again by us and by people who cannot participate right now. I'm so glad that you will be able to have access to this lecture. It's excellent. And I would also like to say that at 6 p.m. we're going to have a session in honor of Professor Rogério Silva, who passed away. It is going to be the last activity of the Clio-Psyché encounter and the 4th Congress of Brazilian History and Psychology. Now let's move on to the last question. Okay, let's move on to the last question. Hi, Thomas. Thanks for your conference. I have a question. Sci-fi productions seem to envision a society even worse than ours. Gisele Toassa saying, bringing up authoritarianism, slavery, and so on. Do you think that these are cautionary tales, or more probably tools for shaping our sensibilities so that we can slowly get used to much more of subhumanism? You understand the professor? Would you like me to repeat?
I understand the question.
Okay, great.
Uh,
Let's just wait for Sergio to stop reading it and for the viewers. Okay, you can go ahead now.
Unfortunately, I think that many TV shows and many movies support actually the normalization of subhumanism. And when I published an article on migration and subhumanism. And what I noticed is that zombie movies, zombie shows are literally operating with subhumanism. Think about a zombie movie. Zombie movies are extremely popular in North America. Some of the most successful shows are zombie shows, and there's 2 free spin-offs on The Walking Dead. I'm not sure you have this show in Brazil that are extremely popular. And what I mean, think about what are zombies? Zombies are literally subhuman. You can kill, maim, destroy, use zombies. They seem to be human, but they're actually not human anymore. They're literally subhuman, and therefore they have no rights. They have no moral ethics, doesn't apply to them, and they are the embodiment, the impersonation of the subhuman. And so if you think about these shows, they're not responsible, so to say, for how we can treat subhumans, but they normalize, I think, the idea that there is maybe classes of human out there. They don't behave really human. They have a substandard behavior. They're deviant behavior. They don't walk normally. They don't talk with us anymore. And therefore, you can do anything you want with them. And in that sense, I think zombie shows, zombie movies normalize the idea of subhumans. And well, okay, there's a zombie you can treat that way. Well, maybe we can treat other people that way, and maybe can do other things that way. And so I think that some of those shows actually prepare us for accepting that there is not enough for people to go around. We have to invoke subhumanism. We maybe have to invoke racism when we talk about other people. We have to focus on ourselves, on our own family. And in that sense, I think they are ideological in contributing to some of those ideas that also instrumental in a fascist subjectivity. So I wouldn't say it doesn't determine that, because it always depends how those movies are interpreted, and people may take different things from those movies and from those shows. So I wouldn't say that they are responsible for that, but I think they normalize the idea that there is human-like creatures that are actually subhuman. And so but there's also movie shows and TV shows that do the opposite, I think, as well. So this is what I mean. There's a struggle then. Who produces more fascist, or who produces more anti-fascist pictures, images, and movies and shows?
Thank you so much, Professor Tate. Teo. It was a great reflection on the TV shows. As agreed, we're going to move on to the end. I would like to thank again the excellent lecture of Professor Thomas that was provocative and reflective and inspiring to all of us who are here. Thank you so much, Professor Teo. And with that, we are going to wrap up and reminding you that at 6 p.m. we're going to have the wrap-up session of the event with a roundtable in honor of Rogério Citofante.
Thank you
So,
and goodbye.
muito obrigado e tchau a todos.